Today, we drift back over 2,000 years to follow the life of Alexander the Great. From his quiet childhood in the hills of Macedonia to his rise as a brilliant strategist and his march across continents. Alexander the Great, a name that steps out of dust and drumbeat, a young king with a lion's impatience and a map that never felt finished. The story begins before the trumpets, before the river crossings, before the clash of bronze on shield rims. It begins with a boy in Pella in Macedon, a palace of sunlit courtyards and mud brick walls that smelled of oil and straw, of horses and new leather. A boy who learned too early that the world respects certainty, and too late that certainty is a knife with two edges. He watched his father, Philip II, a scarred architect of victory who stitched a brawling kingdom into a spear. Philip's shadow was long. He measured armies in strides and mountains in campaigns. Under that shadow, the boy learned to count distance by hoof-beats, and to listen for what men said with their eyes when their tongues were careful. He learned that loyalty rises with reward, and that nothing glues an army together like the promise of movement. There was a horse no one could ride, wild-eyed, black as a night river. Bucephalus snorted froth and smashed the dust with hammering hooves. The courtiers laughed when the boy stepped forward, too small, too proud, too sure. But he turned the horse toward the sun so the beast would not be terrified by its own shadow, and then he moved with him. A whisper on reins, a pact struck without words, and he rode, straight and smooth. The laughter fell silent. Philip watched, then said what fathers rarely say to sons, that Macedon had found a king, and that the father would do well not to stand in the way. Aristotle arrived with scrolls and a voice like flint striking tinder. Under an open sky he set the boy's mind on fire. Names of plants and stars, the curves of logic, the pulse of tragedy, the moral bone beneath policy. The boy learned stories older than empires. He carried them like mirrors for future decisions. How to weigh ambition against duty. How to look at a river and think not only of water, but of bridges, fords, and supply lines. How a city is a mouth with a hunger for grain. How a soldier is a line on a ledger before he is a hero on a hilltop. The news of murder comes like a knife thrown from behind. Philip fell at Aegi amid torchlight and ceremony. Rumors crawled like ants over the corpse. Intrigue, family quarrel, gods displeased. None of it changed the simple arithmetic. The boy was king. 20 years old and already cracking with light. The world around him rippled with calculation. Allies measuring distance to his favor. Enemies stretching for knives. The Greek cities whispered together and hoped this young Macedonian would tumble as quickly as he rose. Thebes misread the wind, walls strong, memory proud, an uprising like old embers blown to flame. The new king marched fast, faster than rumor. He surrounded the city, spoke once, and when the city spat back he drew steel from patience. The walls fell, the houses burned, men died, and the survivors sold into the hard economy of slavery. The lesson spread on the feet of refugees. The king could be terrible, and he moved like weather. The Persian Empire loomed to the east, a continent arranged under a crown, satrapies like puzzle pieces, rivers like highways, post stations like a heartbeat. The great king's court glittered and whispered. And in Macedon, a restless map glowed like candle flame in Alexander's head. He spoke the names softly at night: Hellespont, Granicus, Sardis, Issus, Tyre, Sidon, Memphis, Gaugamela, Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, Bactra. The syllables were stepping stones over a river no one else dared to cross. He sacrificed at Troy and tossed a spear into Asia's soil. A little theater, a big promise. At the Granicus, the Persian satraps waited with cavalry sharp as scimitars. The river ran cold and the banks were high. His generals urged caution. He chose momentum. Hooves splashed. Bronze flashed. The companion cavalry punched into the enemy left. The phalanx rolled like a grinding door. The river became a mirror for drowning horses. Victory tasted of mud and iron. Afterward he walked the field and named the dead, Macedonian and Greek. He sent spoils back to Greece as if paying a debt to ancestors. Then he moved again. Sardis opened its gates like a flower. Cities along the coast measured his speed and chose wisely. Halicarnassus resisted. Stone, sea, stubbornness. Siege engines chattered. Towers creaked. Arrows arced like flocks. He took it in pieces, stubborn as rust. Winter came and he did not stop. He climbed inland where the roads ran thinner and the air felt older. At Gordium he faced the knot, a snarl of oxhide binding a chariot to legend. The story said whoever loosed it would rule Asia. He cut it, some say. Others say he unbound it with patience. The point was not the method. The point was the message. Problems yield under will. Darius assembled an ocean of men at Issus, banners like a forest, chariots like sharks. The Persian king's mother and wife rode in litters, sure of looking on victory. The plain narrowed between mountain and sea. Again the Macedonian line angled like a blade, the phalanx pinned, the companions swung, dust rose. Darius saw a shape in the tumult, not numbers, but decision. He wheeled and fled. The center broke around his absence. In the wreck of banners, Alexander found the royal family trembling. He spoke gently in another language, the grammar of courtesy. The mother bowed to him as if to her son. He raised her up. Mercy can be an empire's scaffold. Tyre hung on the sea like a challenge, an island city with walls that scoffed at any ladder. He built a road out to it, a causeway stone by stone, a feat of hate and engineering. Engineers cursed, divers sweated. Archers shielded the builders with storms of arrows. Tyrian fireships stabbed at the work. The sea swallowed towers. He rebuilt. When the causeway reached the city, he dragged siege engines forward until the walls trembled. The break came like a rotten tooth giving way. The city paid in blood and chains, a lesson written where waves lick away words slowly, but not soon enough for those who watched them. South along the coast. Gaza a thorn. Again the battering, again the iron patience. In Egypt the doors swung open to him, a pharaoh by adoption, a god by ceremony. At Siwa, the desert's sand like whispering glass, he sought an oracle. Men saw him emerge with a new shine in his eyes. The priests spoke of sonship and destiny. He nodded like a king who expected the world to confirm his suspicions. On the Nile he drew lines in the sand and called them boulevards. Alexandria was a vow disguised as a city, a place where tides of language would mix, where books would multiply like stars, where Greek and Egyptian and Persian and Jew would trade words and gods and recipes until they forgot how separate they had once been. East again, always east. Darius gathered his strength a final time on the wide, trampled plain of Gaugamela, the horizon stuffed with men, scythed chariots glittering, elephants restless. Alexander walked the ground at night and marked the soft places, the gullies that bite wheels, the angles of dawn light. In the morning he split the Persian plan like a log, feints on the left, a sucking whirl where the chariots bogged and died, then a spear of horse and man through the seam in the enemy center. He rode straight for the king's standard. Darius looked once too long and fled again. The empire cracked with that single choice. When the dust settled, the young king stood in the hot quiet and knew that something vast had changed forever. Babylon opened her gates as if to a festival. Gardens that breathed water, walls that bragged of distance, streets wide enough for elephants. He walked beneath star-carved ceilings. He sat on a throne where languages braided like river deltas. In Susa he found treasuries forgot by caution, gold soft as bread, silver cold as indifferent moonlight. At Persepolis the palace burned, some say in drunken theater, some say with iron intent. The flames lifted a century of Persian pride and carried it into the black grammar of smoke. He watched with a face no one could read. Later he regretted, perhaps. Or perhaps he understood that every empire needs its parents' house razed to build something new with the same bricks. He hunted Darius across dry distances, a pursuit through salt flats and thorn scrub, across roads so old they were only ideas. They found the great king abandoned on a cart, pierced by a satrap's treachery. Alexander covered the body with a cloak and sent it home in royal dignity. He punished the murderer with a queen's rage and a judge's calm. The old empire had a new executor. Beyond the edges of classical maps lay Sogdia and Bactria, rivers braided with ice melt, fortresses clinging to cliffs like nests, wind that smelled of stone and distance. Guerrillas struck and vanished. Here his genius changed key. Not the grand battle, but the patient reduction. Watchtowers, garrison towns, roads repaired like arteries. Local rulers bribed into civilization. He climbed the Sogdian rock and forced surrender where eagles doubted the climb. He took Roxana's hand and married a landscape. Soldiers grumbled at the Persian dress, the proskynesis, the coins stamped with unfamiliar titles. But the king was building a lattice, not a ladder, a network where trade would move even when armies did not. There was a wound that never healed. Hephaestion, friend and second self, partners in laughter and counsel, a fever reached where arrows had not. The body went cold. The king tore his clothes, cut his hair, forbade music, ordered shrines. In grief he showed the empire that his heart could break like any man's. But sorrow is a river, and a king cannot drown in it. The army had another horizon to chase. India waited with jungled humidity and a geometry of rivers. The Hydaspes ran full and sly. Opposite camped Porus, a king tall as a legend, with elephants like moving hills. Night fell. Rain came like hammer blows. Alexander moved upstream in silence, crossed where the river blinked, pivoted back. Dawn found Macedonians where they had not been. The battle broke in patterns new to Greek eyes. Elephants screamed, horses panicked, mud swallowed sandals. He held his line, found the angle, broke the hinge, and Porus stood wounded but never bowed. Asked how he wished to be treated, he said, like a king, And Alexander smiled the smile of a man who recognized himself in a mirror far from home. He restored Porus to his throne and doubled it. Victory with respect buys more than victory alone. Then came the refusal, the hyphasis, the horizon to nowhere. The men's eyes like empty bowls, years of marching, miles of mountain and memory, rain that never stopped, arrows that grew out of the ground like grass. They would not go farther. He walked among them and found the limit of charisma. He yielded to necessity and sulked in a tent like Achilles until reason returned. They cut 12 altars on the river bank to stand for the marches they would not make, then turned back and discovered that retreat is also an empire. The Gedrosian desert was a dare to the gods, heat that made thought run like wax, salt winds, dunes where whole companies vanished in a sigh. He marched because maps demanded it, or because pride could not go around what it could attempt through. Water skins emptied into sand. Men licked pebbles and dreamed of rain. He kept walking at the front, sharing the last cup when a scout brought it, pouring it into the sand where all could see, a gesture worth more than the sip. The bones of that march learned his name. The survivors learned that leadership includes suffering on purpose. They came staggered and thinner into Carmania. Ships met them on the coast. Grain rose like mercy. The army feasted and pretended the desert had been a trick. Then on to Susa, to policy, to marriages designed like bridges. Macedonians paired with Persian nobility in a ceremony of silk and calculation. The old guard muttered. Some refused. He replaced some generals, executed others, pardoned many. Hard balances in a mind that wanted one fabric out of many threads. At Opus, the army's patience snapped. Talk of sending veterans home with Persian boys to fill their ranks. Fury boiled. He faced them in the raw air and spoke the ledger of his life. The dangers shared, the wealth distributed, the towns founded, the gods appeased. He dismissed them all. Then the weeping came, as if the anger had been a mask for fear of being left by the only man who made their days make sense. He embraced them. The storm passed. The machine hummed again. He sailed the Euphrates and Tigris like a man testing the length of a leash. He mapped marshes, argued with engineers about canals and harbors. He planned an Arabian expedition and drew a belt of ports that would hug a continent. He inspected ships, smelted new anchors, ordered fresh wood. He placed governors, checked accounts, hanged thieves who had counted on distance to excuse their crimes. He calculated like a banker in a warrior's cloak. Babylon breathed heat and omen. Birds flew wrong. Priests muttered. He pushed omens aside and built plans like scaffolds, then fever, a prick in the skin that widened into darkness. Days of sweat and ice water and muffled voices. He lay on a couch and the generals filed past while he raised his hand in a grip that felt like goodbye. They asked to whom he left the empire, to the strongest, or to Crateros, or to a dream. The room heard what it needed, and history wrote a quarrel. The breath left him. The map shuddered. His body became a prize. Rumor says Ptolemy stole it south and gave Egypt a king and a saint in one golden coffin. The empire divided, recombined, shattered again under the weight of men who had learned too well under a master. Antigonus, the one-eyed, rolled dice with armies. Seleucus stitched together the East like a quilt. Cassander guarded Macedon with chill hands. Lysimachus looked over Thrace like a hawk who feared other hawks. The wars of the successors were thunderstorms on a land he had cleared for planting. But something survived the quarrels. Cities grew like coral from the reefs he laid down. Alexandria poured books into the world until libraries learned to dream. Greek became a bridge between strangers. Coins traveled with his face long after his breath had stopped. The silver stamping markets with quiet authority. Gymnasia opened beside old temples. Marriage contracts listed Greek months in Egyptian ink. Merchants learned new winds. Sailors named stars with fresh syllables. Doctors compared fevers across languages and found that knowledge enlarges when it travels. A soldier's life under him had been a rhythm. March at dawn. Break at noon if the sun dared. Drill in dust. Eat barley bread that chewed like duty. Sharpen sarissa points until splinters blooded the fingers. Oil the shield grip. Oil the mind with gossip. Forget the village you left because it was safer that way. In wet seasons, the camp smelled of wool and smoke. In dry seasons, of leather and iron. Pay chests opened with a clink that forgave many orders. Wounds itched into weather veins. Scars told stories no scribe could fully catch. The phalanx was a wall that walked, 16 men deep, pikes like a wheat field of death. On the flanks the companions coiled and struck. Skirmishers filled the sky with an alphabet of stones and arrows. Siegecraft was a family of tricks. Torsian engines that hissed like snakes. Rams with iron beaks. Sappers who listened to walls with their palms. Every city thought its traditions would save it until wood and rope and patience taught a colder lesson. He stole good ideas. Persian couriers became his yam. Persian accountants became his ledgers. Indian elephants became his living battering rams. Egyptian grain became his calendar. Greek language became his passport. He adjusted the empire like a saddle until the fit felt natural. The old men of Macedon grumbled into wine cups. The young learned new dances and forgot why anyone had been angry. Bucephalus died somewhere under a sky that did not know how to mourn. The king built a city and gave it the horse's name. A kindness that said more than monuments. Memory is a city with open gates. Hephaestion's funeral pyre bit the clouds. Statues rose, priests sang. The empire stood still. Grief, policy, theater, all braided like ropes, strong enough to tow the ship of state through a storm. In private, he sat late and touched the ring that still smelled faintly of oil and sweat. In public, he gave orders no one else could bear to give. He could be cruel. He could be generous. He could pass a death sentence before breakfast and pardon a thief by noon. He could forgive a city and burn a palace. He could spend coin like water and count with a miser's precision. He loved glory as if it were a person whose face he never quite saw. He loved speed as if time were an enemy camp. He loved building as if a foundation stone were a promise he meant to keep for 200 years he did not have. The ground remembers hoofbeats. The deserts remember the shapes of marching columns etched in mirage. In Bactria, old men still tell of a king whose gold helmets glinted on ridgelines, while goats stared and chewed indifferently. In Egypt, the wind runs a dry finger over broken hieroglyphs and whispers Greek names. In Anatolia, farmers turn up coins and argue over which king's profile frowns on the silver. In the Punjab, the river still lifts its cold shoulder against fords and thinks of elephants. An empire is a machine that eats problems and excretes ceremonies. His was a machine built at a speed that makes mechanics nervous, and yet it held just long enough for the world to change shape, long enough for traders to map new courage, for scholars to find each other, for gods to learn to share altars without killing each other's priests, long enough for farmers to plant olives in lands where no one had yet thought to love slow trees. In council, he sat listening as if the table were a battlefield, eyes moving, fingers quiet. Some voices he trusted like old ropes. Some he weighed against gossip carried by men who liked walking between tents. He took notes in his head, and in the morning the notes were orders. He punished theft from the poor with a clean brutality that made nobles stiffen. He rewarded a scout for a good lie that saved lives, and punished a herald for a true word spoken at the wrong hour. He believed in the grammar of victory. Subject, verb, object, we march, we strike, we take. He had plans laid like a spear rack, Arabia's coasts threaded with ports, a circumnavigation of Africa that existed as rumor and courage. Colonists sent to the Oxus to teach vines patience. A road across the Zagros that would shorten winter. A canal that would make Babylon a gate between rivers and seas. He would have needed 2 lives, perhaps 3. The fever did not care. After him, maps learned to be complicated, bright kingdoms edged in sword steel. Ptolemy's Egypt full of scrolls and gold light. Seleucid roads strung like beads across deserts. Antigonid phalanxes drilling under a sky that remembered Philip. Pergamon folding its library like a rival's dream. Bactrian Greeks coining gods with hybrid faces. Merchants carrying amphorae under palm trees. Selling oil to men who prayed in languages neither side understood, but both respected in the market. The legend grows where certainty thins. Some say he never lost a battle. Some count sieges as hours of negotiation with stone. Some say he died of poison. Some count the cups and the grief and the heat. Some say he became a god. Some point to the altars and the birthday games and the silver mask. The truth walks with the army and sleeps under the same sky. The truth is that a man with relentless lungs pulled the world's edges together and taught them to speak, and the seams he stitched have never fully split. If you trace his life on a wall-sized map, your finger will begin to ache. If you read his orders, your breath will quicken at their clarity. If you sleep beside the ruins of one of his cities, you will hear stray dogs, argue with mosquitoes, and in the long hour before dawn, you may think you hear standard-bearers creak and a horse paw at a hitching post. You may imagine a young king stepping out into the cool and looking up. Orion the same as ever, the Pleiades shivering near the horizon, the river running past like a thought he hadn't finished. He was a conqueror. He was a founder. He was a reader of omens and a breaker of limits. He was a friend with a human laugh and a king who could make statues tremble. He loved work that made the back complain. He loved words that made the mind straighten its shoulders. He loved the feeling of distance shrinking under the argument of speed. He loved the way a town square smells at sunrise when the bakers open their doors, and a city promises to be civil again despite what armies demand. Time has turned him into parable and warning. Students learn of hubris and hybris. Generals learn about flank speed and decisive points. Politicians learn that mercy is cheaper than rebuilding burned cities. Merchants learn that borders are best when they are polite rather than armed. Poets learn that grief can animate marble. Engineers learn that a causeway to an island city can be built if you accept that the sea will take part of your work back every night, and you must give it more the next day. There is a road outside Babylon that runs under dust like a string in a pocket. Somewhere near it he stood with a reed pen, gestured at a shore that needed a harbor, asked a question without a question mark, and made a plan with a man who could build. Somewhere near it he lay with fever and whispered to a friend who could not hear through the heat. Somewhere near it a column of soldiers passed years later and told a story to boys who were not yet born when the king had breathed. The gravel listened and kept nothing. The stories moved on with the men. If you want to know him, count not the battles but the cities, not the dead but the roads, not the crowns but the bridges. Count the schools that opened because a garrison needed reading clerks. Count the gods that learned new names. Count the families that kept 2 calendars without forgetting birthdays. Count the markets where weights became honest because a king who hated lying also hated loose measures. Count the libraries that piled papyrus until a spark someday would be too much for them. Count the languages that learned to loan each other words for things neither had before. And then step back. Look at the sweep. A boy on a black horse rides out of a courtyard and does not stop. He picks fights with mountains and persuades rivers. He makes cities argue with themselves about whether to resist. He writes his name in letters large enough for the next age to read, and when his hand falls, the letters do not fade. They blur, they move, they reform, but they remain. The world he left behind did not know how not to be different any more. Alexander the Great, a storm with a scholar's spine, a builder who carried a torch, a king who asked the horizon to be reasonable and then made it so. The roads he opened are still there, under asphalt and politics. The ideas he mixed are still there, in alphabets and recipes. The caution he inspires is a hand on a shoulder. The courage he inspires is a foot on a stirrup. Listen in the long pause between 2 city noises. You may hear the quiet of a camp at night, a man moving among sleeping soldiers, touching a shield here, a horse there, speaking not to wake them but to remind himself that morning is a promise and not a threat. And when that morning comes, the tents strike, the dust rises, the column stretches like a river that has remembered its source. The king rides forward, narrow-eyed, untired by the distance he does not respect. The standards lift. The drums find the cadence of inevitability. And the map, once again, becomes smaller under a will that refuses stillness. The story does not end. It recedes, as all stories do, into the long bright wake of consequence. The world keeps turning, and in its turning keeps the faint hoofbeat of a youth who chose movement over safety, and taught the rest of us what a single lifetime can hold when it is spent like a lamp at full flame.